Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, September 19th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. And we have a video to show you in the second half of the hour. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries, encouraged sotto voce by our government, as an excuse, not the reason, for their wars. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. AWARE was formed 16 years ago, after the attacks on New York and Washington of 9/11-2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war. Barack Obama was the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use in this country comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa, what we call the Mideast, gives the U.S. a chokehold over economic rivals, from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph for the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the more than 700 foreign military bases. Russia has 15, China has 1. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into three-quarters of the world's countries. 4, stop U.S. support for human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account briefly tonight, beginning with some comments on President Trump's speech at the UN this morning. We haven't seen a full text yet, but we've seen most of it, and we've seen an account of what Trump said at the UN, and it does not inspire confidence. We have some other announcements and comments to make. We want to begin with an announcement that there is scheduled for next Saturday, the 20th, for this coming Saturday, let's be clear about this, for this coming Saturday, September 23rd, an anti-war teach-in. Teach-in is a venerable practice going back to the Vietnam War, which is now renewed on all the channels that bring in public television this week. The Vietnam War led to popular discussions, political discussions, often on university campuses, but not always, that came to be known as teach-ins because they were attempt to give a good account of what the war in Vietnam was really about at the time it was occurring, rather than the accounts one was hearing on the American media, which were thoroughly sanitized. The American war in Vietnam was not an attempt to stop communism. The American war in Vietnam was an assault on a country which was liberating itself from the colonization that had preceded the 1960s, and the U.S. was desperately trying to reduce Vietnam and all of Southeast Asia to the dependent status on the American economic empire that had emerged from the Second World War. The great crime, probably the greatest crime, international crime, since the Second World War was the American assault on Vietnam, and it was extremely important that the propaganda account of that war and what it was about be spread abroad amongst Americans, both then, 50 years ago, and also today. The teach-in was an attempt to counter that, to tell the truth about the war and what a crime it was. And the tradition is being renewed here in Champaign-Urbana this coming Saturday with a teach-in at the Channing Murray Foundation, adjacent to the U of I campus, the corner of Oregon and Matthews Streets. That's Saturday the 23rd at 1 p.m. It's hosted by AWARE, the organization that brings you this program, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, and SEE, Students for Economic Empowerment at UIUC. They invite you to join us for this teach-in about the dangers of U.S. imperialism and its profit and resource-fueled drives for conflict abroad. Speakers and topics at the teach-in include Francis Boyle, professor of law at the little law school down the street, Morton Brussel, professor of physics emeritus at the University of Illinois, your obedient servant, myself, retired visiting professor at the same university, David Green of the Jewish Voice for Peace, speaking on Palestine and Israel, David Johnson of the World Labor Hour on WRFU, speaking on the cost of war and Venezuela. Vukoni Lupa Lasaga, a PhD candidate, speaking about the U.S. in Africa. Father Tom Royer, talking about El Salvador. Rich Whitney, Esquire of the Illinois Green Party, speaking on U.S. support for dictatorships around the world, and Paula Bradshaw of the Illinois Green Party, speaking about U.S. interventions in Libya and Syria. If you'd like more information about this teach-in, which, as I say, is 1 o'clock Saturday, the Channing Murray Foundation, if you want more information, you can contact my colleague Karen Aram from AWARE. Karen Aram, email address is her name, Karen, A-R-A-M, all lowercase, at hotmail.com. As I mentioned, Trump gave a speech at the UN this morning, and the reports will be on the usual news broadcasts, I'm sure, but the description of the speech I have here from the excellent Pepe Escobar captures, I think, its salient points. He says the winners from Trump's speech are North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela, the object of American wrath as expressed by Donald Trump. It's peculiar in a way because, of course, American foreign policy is based on hostility to Russia and China, as it has been for literally generations. But we have a new axis of evil in Trump's account of American foreign policy in this morning's speech. Remember, George Bush the younger had an axis of evil to set out his war, the greatest crime of the 21st century so far, the attack on Iraq. Now, the new axis of evil, according to the president this morning, is North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. In the event of an honest discussion of American foreign policy, we might begin to understand why the U.S. chooses these and avoids the real objects of its foreign policy, that is Russia and China. As Pepe Escobar says, under this rubric, Syria is a mini-evil, and so is Cuba. Sideshows, perhaps, of American reassertion of worldwide imperialism. Ukraine and the South China Sea got a fleeting mention in Trump's speech, but no direct accusations against Russia and China, the real objects of American hostility. Daesh, that is ISIS, the Islamic State, got a few paragraphs, not as evil as North Korea, of course, or as Iran, but still in all evil. And that's a standard American observation. Trump said, and I quote, "The United States is a compassionate nation. U.S. may have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea." That, too, is a quote. "Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for him and his regime," said Trump. Rocket Man is his description of the president of North Korea. "Our country has achieved more against ISIS in the last 8 months than it has in the years before combined," said Trump. We could probably hear the sound of Russian laughter even here, because, of course, the fight against ISIS, or Daesh, has been carried on by Russia, not by the United States. The fight has been a result of the fact that the U.S. has covertly sponsored the Islamic State. The Islamic State grew out of the American attack on Iraq, the destruction of 1 million Iraqis, and the reaction of mainly Sunni Iraqis to the great crime that the U.S. perpetrated there. As it spread throughout Iraq and Syria, it was finally only the Russian support for the Syrian government that made serious inroads into the control of the Islamic State over these regions. The reason for that was that the United States was covertly sponsoring the Islamic State because it accomplished sorts of things that the U.S. wanted to accomplish, mainly attacking the government of Syria. The Obama administration rounded up the most fanatic fighters it could find, Islamic terrorists, and sent them into Syria with the prospect of bringing down the Syrian government. Why did the Obama administration want to destroy the Syrian government? Because it wasn't following orders. Syria is a major oil producer, allied with Iran, and Iran and Syria were not obedient to the American control of the Middle East, which has been the policy of American governments, at least since the Second World War. The Syrian government had to go. President Assad, who presided over a multi-religious, multiracial, non-sectarian government in Damascus, he presided over it pretty bitterly, pretty savagely on occasion, so savagely that the U.S. outsourced some of its torture to the government of Syria when it could rely on President Assad. But beginning in a local rebellion in 2011, the U.S. supported a jihadist or terrorist attack on the Syrian government most of the terrorists came from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in order to overthrow President Assad in Damascus. The appearance of the Islamic State added to the pressure on the Damascus government, and the U.S. had no interest in countering the Islamic State so long as it was threatening the American enemy in the region, that is Syria. So the inroads or the attacks on the Islamic State came only after Russia joined Syria in those attacks. The Russian troops were legally in Syria in that they were invited there by a legitimate government, whatever you may think of it, the government of President Assad. The American troops in Syria were there illegally because they, of course, were not invited by the government of Syria, which they were trying to overthrow. The destruction of ISIS then is not, as President Trump says, a result of American policy, but a result of Russian policy. Trump says in his speech this morning, "We want harmony and friendship, not conflict and strife." You wouldn't know that if you watched what the American troops were actually doing, not only in Syria, but around the world since then. At the end of the speech, Bibi Netanyahu of Israel was smiling broadly. That was one thing the cameras picked up, because it was precisely Netanyahu's anti-Iranian policy that was so embraced by Trump at the UN. We have to understand what the last administration was doing in regard to Iran to make any sense of the hostility demonstrated, if that's not too mild a word, by the Trump administration towards Iran. Iran is, to the great dismay of American policymakers, in an effective alliance with Russia and China in the integration, economic and otherwise, of Eurasia. Iran is, if you like, the furthest west extension of that Eurasian integration. The United States has a long history of overthrowing independent governments in Iran. The crucial point came in 1953 when the CIA produced a revolt in Iran against an elected government and overthrew that government and reinstalled a monarch, the Shah, in Iran. The Shah was cheerfully hated by many Iranians, and his oppressive rule led finally to a revolution in 1979, which overthrew the Shah and established the present regime in Iran. The U.S. has never forgiven the Iranian Revolution for overthrowing its boy, the Shah, and reestablishing an independent control over the region, which the U.S. had negated by its support for the Shah. So the U.S. wants to restore the status quo ante, the status quo in which Iran followed orders from Washington, as all Middle Eastern governments are supposed to do. The independence of Middle Eastern governments in this oil-producing region is the object of American foreign policy in the region, and indeed the reason the U.S. is busily killing people throughout the region and has been doing so for generations. Iran is the thorn in the side of the American control of the Middle East. Now that has to be understood, I think, if you want to make sense of the arrangement that the Obama administration came to with Iran. It was not very well reported in this country. We were told that what was going on in the negotiations between the Obama administration and the Iranian government was an attempt to try to end Iran's progress towards the construction of a nuclear weapon. The problem was that Iran was not constructing a nuclear weapon. And giving up the possibility of constructing a nuclear weapon was reasonable for the Iranians to do, since they weren't doing it anyhow. But the U.S. presented it that way in order to give an account of why it was making any arrangement whatsoever with Iran. The JCPOA, the Iran deal, as Trump and others have called it, was an attempt to reincorporate some technical difficulties here, but it's the sort of technical difficulties that the U.S. has been looking for in regard to Iran from the beginning. The important thing to understand about the U.S. policy towards Iran is that Iran was once part of the overall pattern of control, as Henry Kissinger used to say, of American control of Middle East energy resources, and then with the revolution, it dropped out of that. What the Obama administration was trying to do was reincorporate Iran into that overall pattern of control of Middle Eastern energy resources and do it by a diplomatic agreement with Iran. It came to some version of that, even though it was done under false pretenses, the pretense that it was stopping Iran from building a nuclear weapon. Remember, when Iran was a client of the United States and the Shah ruled, the U.S. offered nuclear weapons to Iran on the grounds that they needed them. The Iranians who thought it was worthwhile that Iran have a nuclear weapon did exist in various times in recent Iranian history, and the Americans were at one time at least complacent with that idea. But that's not what was on the table in the discussions between the Obama administration and Iran. What was at stake here was that control of oil flows, which the U.S. needs as a chokehold against competing economies around the world. The attempt to incorporate Iran into that arrangement was what the Obama people were about, and that's what looks like has a good chance of coming apart in the Trump administration. Iran's President Rouhani has developed the unbeatable argument on nuclear negotiations. He says that the Iran nuclear deal, which is working because it was never really about nukes anyhow, could be used as a model elsewhere. But if the U.S. suddenly decides to unilaterally pull out of the Iranian deal, how could the North Koreans possibly be convinced it's worth it to sit down with the Americans to negotiate anything? That seems to be quite a reasonable question, and the dangers of it are obvious. The suggestion of the North Korean nuclear deal, the suggestion of a North Korean nuclear deal has been put forward particularly by Russia and China, who have said that what should be done in Korea is what they call a double freeze. A freeze on the military provocations that the United States and South Korea have been carrying on for some time, and a freeze on the development of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons in North Korea. North Korea, in fact, offered that to the Obama administration, and the Obama administration turned them down. They renewed the offer when the Trump administration came into office, and the Trump administration turned them down. So the notion that the Trump administration is today dealing with the threat of a nuclear North Korea is very wide of the mark. That's not what's at stake at all, and the real objects of American policy, Russia and China, have made that clear by saying there's an obvious solution to this dispute between the United States and North Korea, the so-called double freeze. The freeze on weapons development in the North and the freeze on military activities in South Korea. Military activities by the U.S. and its client state, South Korea, in the South. what the U.S. Is doing is continuing its war provocations, which ramped up under the Obama administration, and using North Korea as the excuse for the general American policy of retarding the economic development of Eurasia. One of the greatest aspects of that development these days, of course, is the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's program of economic connection and integration throughout Eurasia. This is deeply offensive to American capitalists. This is deeply offensive to the American 1%. And indeed, this sort of talk, economic integration of Eurasia, has offended American policymakers back into the 19th century. If you doubt this, go read about the open door policy in America in 1899, the American open door policy in 1899. The open door was into China, and what the U.S. was afraid of was that the other colonial powers, the other 19th century colonial powers, Britain, France, Germany, would exclude American capitalists from the exploitation of China. No, says the Americans, we must have an open door. All Western capitalists must be able to exploit China equally. Now, in some sense, that policy never changed. Policy is right to today, but the problem is that the policy of American exploitation of Eurasia was opposed by the Eurasians themselves. That's, for example, what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s, the Second World War, was all about. The greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that Japan wished to establish in Asia would close the door to American exploitation of Asia, and therefore the Americans had to oppose it. The American policy remains one of worldwide economic exploitation for the benefit of the American 1%, and anyone who tries to oppose it is going to be opposed by the American government. The great contradiction to that American policy came in 1949, when the Chinese Revolution succeeded and China excluded the foreigners, Japanese and Western, from the economic development of China and launched upon an economic development that has had remarkable consequences to this day. The present form of that economic development is what China calls the Belt and Road Initiative, this connection with economies throughout Asia and even with Europe. The American policy, although it's not announced as such, has been to oppose and hamper the Belt and Road initiatives as much as possible. And the dispute over North Korea is a roundabout way, we might say, in order to hamper the Chinese development. That's why the U.S. keeps saying the Chinese must help us in putting down North Korea. What the U.S. is actually asking for throughout here is a reduction in the Belt and Road Initiative in a way that is compatible with American economic hegemony. You're watching Aware on the Air. We try to talk about American war and the reasons for it, and we are going to now turn to a discussion from the with a number of important commentators about the real situation of American policy over time. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 38th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. Our thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him, also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Don't forget the teach-in this Saturday at 1 p.m. at Shanny Murray on the U of I campus, or adjacent to the U of I campus, where a number of local scholars and activists will be talking about the war policy of the United States, past and future, I'm afraid. And see the Facebook page for AWARE for information about that teach-in and other things that we've spoken of this evening. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. And we had another example this week where Chelsea Manning had a brief position, a temporary position at Harvard, withdrawn by that august institution at the insistence of the CIA on the grounds that Manning, who had revealed some of the crimes of the American government, should not be given such a platform. A shameful behavior, a shameful bit of behavior by the institution that Noam Chomsky once called the Academy for the Passive and Obedient in Harvard Square. Continue to be passive and be obedient in Harvard Square. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.